The aliens celebrated humanity's eradication. Then the beacon activated. Part 1. Silence across the stars. The war had lasted 11 years. 11 years of fire and metal. 11 years of human ships burning in the dark between planets. 11 years of cities on Earth crumbling under weapons that no human hand had built. And then, 3 months before the end, the humans simply stopped fighting. No more resistance. No more guerrilla attacks on Conclave supply lines. No more encrypted radio signals bouncing off the moon. Just silence. Clean, complete, and total silence. The Conclave took it as surrender. They were wrong. On the day the last human city went dark, Admiral Darek stood on the observation deck of his command ship and watched Earth burn. It was a slow burn, not dramatic, not explosive. The planet did not crack open or boil away. It simply grew quieter. The lights that had once dotted the night side of the planet, those tiny warm clusters of yellow and white that humans called cities, went out one by one, like candles being snuffed by a careful hand. Darek watched it all with cold, professional satisfaction. He had spent 6 years commanding the final push. 6 years of frustrating losses, unexpected human tactics, soldiers under his command coming home in pieces, or not coming home at all. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest, not the most intelligent by Conclave standards, and certainly not the most advanced. But they were, without question, the most stubborn things the galaxy had ever produced. That stubbornness was finally over. He turned to his communications officer and gave the order. The victory signal went out across every known frequency, broadcast in all 17 languages of the Conclave member species. The message was simple, clear, final. Humanity is extinct. The war is over. The response from across the galaxy was immediate. Celebrations erupted on dozens of worlds. Species that had spent years living in quiet fear of human expansion, fear of their strange weapons, their unpredictable strategies, their unsettling refusal to simply die when logic said they should. Those species poured into their streets and made noise. Fireworks on some worlds, ritual songs on others. The Conclave's central broadcast network ran the victory announcement on a loop for 3 full days. Darek allowed himself one small moment of pride. Then he went back to work. He did not notice the faint energy reading that blinked once on a long-range scanner near the asteroid belt, then disappeared. His scanner officer noticed it, logged it as a debris reflection, and moved on. It was a reasonable conclusion. The asteroid belt was full of debris now. Human debris, mostly. Broken ships, shattered stations, the wreckage of 11 years of desperate fighting. No one looked closer. Deep inside the asteroid called Ceres, in a chamber carved by human hands over the course of 9 years, a man named Junho sat alone at a metal desk and ate a protein bar. The chamber was not large. It was not comfortable. The walls were raw rock, sealed with industrial foam, and lined with cables that ran in every direction like the roots of some underground plant. The air recyclers hummed. The lights were dim and slightly orange because full-spectrum lighting had been deemed an unnecessary use of power. It smelled like metal and recycled air, and something faintly chemical that Junho had long since stopped noticing. He was not a soldier. He had never fired a weapon in his life. He was an engineer, the kind of engineer who liked problems that other people had already given up on. Quiet, thorough, patient in a way that sometimes made the people around him uncomfortable. He had a habit of going very still when he was thinking, so still that people sometimes checked to make sure he was breathing. He finished the protein bar. He folded the wrapper carefully and placed it in the small waste container beside his desk, because old habits stayed with a person even at the end of the world. Then he reached across the desk and flipped open a small protective cover, exposing a single black button. He did not hesitate. He pressed it. There was no dramatic sound, no alarm, no explosion, no deep mechanical rumble running through the rock around him. The only thing that changed was a small light on the panel in front of him, which shifted from red to green. Somewhere deep in the systems built into the walls of the chamber, a process began. Data began to move. A signal began to build, piece by piece, like a very long and complicated sentence being typed one letter at a time. The beacon had been activated. Junho leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The rock above him was about 400 meters thick before it gave way to the vacuum of space. Outside that vacuum, somewhere in the distance, the Conclave fleet was still circling Earth's ruins, still celebrating, still absolutely certain that they had won. He thought about Earth. He let himself do that for exactly 2 minutes. He had learned to put a time limit on it, because if he didn't, the grief had a way of expanding until it filled everything. He thought about the smell of rain on warm concrete. He thought about the specific way the sky looked at dusk, when the light was going golden and the clouds were the color of old roses. He thought about his mother's voice, which he could still hear clearly in his memory. The way she called his name when dinner was ready, the ordinary sound of it, the sound of a world that was gone. 2 minutes. Then he stopped. He pulled up the timer on his screen. It had already started counting down the moment the button was pressed. The numbers were clean and simple. He read them once, confirmed they were correct, and nodded to himself. 97 days remaining. The door to the chamber opened, and a woman walked in. Her name was Dae, and she had been a pilot in what used to be the Korean Space Defense Corps, before the Defense Corps ceased to exist, along with everything else. She was tall, with short cropped hair, and the kind of posture that never fully relaxed. The posture of someone who had spent years in a cockpit, expecting something to go wrong at any moment. She was carrying 2 cups of something hot. She set 1 cup down in front of Junho without a word. He accepted it without a word. They had been working together for 3 years in this rock, and they had moved past the point where every exchange needed to be spoken aloud. She looked at the green light on the panel. She looked at the timer. She sat down in the chair across from him, wrapped both hands around her cup, and looked at the wall. Outside, across the vacuum, and the debris fields, and the slowly cooling ruins of Earth, the Conclave kept celebrating. They had no idea what the green light meant. They had no idea what the beacon was. They had no idea that the silence they had mistaken for defeat had actually been something else entirely. The aliens celebrated humanity's eradication. Then, the beacon activated. Part 2. Dancing on Graves. The celebrations lasted for weeks. On the Conclave's homeworld, the victory was declared a public holiday. Schools were closed. Factories ran at half capacity. The streets of every major city filled with crowds who sang the old songs, the ones written during the early days of the war, when humans first pushed back against Conclave expansion, and the galaxy had learned, with genuine shock, that this small and unremarkable species was going to make the whole thing very difficult. Now those songs had new endings. The difficult thing was gone. Diplomat Rails stood at a podium on the central broadcast stage and gave a speech that lasted 40 minutes. He was a tall, narrow-limbed member of the VEF species, with 4 arms and pale gray skin, and a voice that carried well in large spaces. He had spent the last 6 years as the Conclave's public face for the war effort, explaining to nervous allied species why the war was taking so long, reassuring trained partners that human aggression would eventually be contained, smiling in that careful diplomatic way whenever someone asked an uncomfortable question. Now he did not have to be careful anymore. He spoke about peace. He spoke about the galaxy finally being free from the threat of human expansion. He used the word liberation several times, which was an interesting word choice, given that it was the humans who were now extinct, But no one in the crowd questioned it. The crowd cheered. The broadcast went out on every conclave frequency. Species across dozens of systems watched and felt their shoulders drop with relief they had been carrying for years. Species who had suffered under human trade embargoes celebrated the loudest. There were 17 systems that had been economically strangled by human negotiating tactics. Not by weapons or invasion, but by contracts and leverage and the peculiar human talent for finding the exact point at which another species needed something badly enough to agree to almost anything. The humans had called it trade. Other species had called it something less polite. Those systems now planned festivals that would run for a full month. Nobody asked the question. Not one diplomat, not one military analyst, not one intelligence officer with enough rank to be heard stopped and asked the obvious thing. Why did the humans stop fighting? Not why did they lose. That part had a clean enough answer, given that the conclave had eventually brought enough firepower to bear that even human stubbornness had limits. No, the question nobody asked was why they had stopped 3 months before the end. 3 months before the last city fell. 3 months before the final bombardment. They had simply gone quiet, pulled back, and waited. The resistance that had made conclave generals furious for a decade just evaporated. At the time, conclave command had called it a collapse of morale, a final surrender of spirit. They had written long reports about it. The reports used phrases like psychological exhaustion and terminal resource depletion and inevitable capitulation. The reports were filed. The reports were praised. The reports were wrong. But nobody knew that yet. Junho knew that Daiei was struggling with the waiting. He could tell not because she said anything, she almost never said anything unnecessary, but because she had started sharpening the same blade every evening for 2 hours. It was a practical blade, military issue, one she'd carried since before everything fell apart. It did not need to be sharpened this often. A blade sharpened every night for a month would eventually stop being a blade and start being something dangerously thin. But he said nothing about it, because some people needed their hands to be doing something when their mind was working through things it couldn't fix. He understood that. He had his own version of it. His was math. He ran calculations that didn't need running. He checked systems that were working fine and didn't need checking. He sat at his desk in the orange-lit chamber and moved numbers around screens, not because the numbers needed moving, but because it kept the part of his brain that wanted to scream occupied with something quiet and structured. On the 42nd day after the beacon activated, Day spoke first. "Are we sure they're coming?" she asked. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the wall, which she did when she was asking questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. That was a habit she had gotten used to. He didn't answer quickly, because he didn't like giving answers he wasn't sure of. "No," he said. She nodded. That was honest, and she preferred honest. "But the math is good," he added. "The launch windows were correct. The ships were built to spec. The navigation packages were tested for 6 years before they went dark. If nothing catastrophic happened—" "A lot of catastrophic things happened," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but not to them. We made sure of that. That was the part that had cost the most. Not money. Money had stopped meaning anything around year 4 of the war. What it had cost was choices. Hard ones. The kind that kept a person awake in the dark and made the ceiling of a rock chamber feel very low and very close." The 17 ships had been launched quietly, one by one, over the course of 9 years. Each launch had been covered by something else. A battle that drew conclave attention, a false signal, a decoy operation that cost lives, specifically so that a single ship could slip away into the deep dark without being detected. 17 launches, 17 covers. Each cover had been bought with something real and irreplaceable. Junho thought about each one sometimes. He did not let himself do it often. The timer on his screen read 55 days remaining. Day finally stopped looking at the wall. She looked at the timer instead. Then she picked up the blade and started sharpening it again, and the soft, steady sound of metal on stone filled the small chamber and mixed with the hum of the air recyclers. Outside in the galaxy, Rael was finishing his speech. The crowd was cheering. The celebrations were at full volume. No one heard the beacon signal building in the dark. No one noticed the mathematics of it. The way it moved through space, not like a shout, but like a very careful, very deliberate whisper, aimed at exactly the right set of ears. No one looked at the asteroid belt twice. In the Conclave's Central Intelligence Office, a junior analyst named Miran filed a routine debris report about a faint energy reading near Ceres, marked it as non-significant, and went back to her main work. She was thorough and she was careful, but she was also junior, and junior analysts did not push back on conclusions that senior officers had already reached. She would think about that report again later. She would think about it quite a lot. The aliens celebrated humanity's eradication. Then the beacon activated. Part 3. The Whisper in the Dark. Mirren had studied humans for 9 years. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was required for her position as an intelligence analyst in the Conclave's 4th-tier data division. She had started studying them because early in the war, she had noticed something in the data that made no sense, and she had never been able to leave a thing alone once it stopped making sense. The thing that made no sense was this: humans lost battles at a statistically normal rate. When the Conclave had superior numbers and superior firepower in a given engagement, humans lost. That was expected. That was how war worked. But the losses were always slightly too clean. The retreats were always slightly too organized. The casualties on the human side were always slightly lower than they should have been, given the circumstances. Just slightly. Not enough to flag. Not enough to make anyone suspicious. But Miran counted things that other analysts didn't bother counting, and the pattern was there if you looked for it. The humans were not fighting to win. They had not been fighting to win for a very long time. They had been fighting to last. She had written a report about this in year 7 of the war. The report had been received politely, evaluated by a senior analyst who called it an interesting perspective, and then filed in a drawer where it quietly stopped existing. She was told that she was overcomplicating the data. She was told that humans fought hard because humans were stubborn, not because they had some long-term plan that the entire Conclave intelligence apparatus had somehow missed. She was junior. She was told to go back to her assigned work. She went back to her assigned work. She also kept her own private notes, because she was the kind of person who kept private notes. After the victory was declared, most of her division celebrated. They had a small gathering in the break room with synthesized food and drinks, and someone put on music. Mirren attended for exactly the amount of time required to not seem strange, then went back to her desk and opened the file she had saved on the Ceres energy reading. It was still there, still faint, still categorized as debris reflection. She pulled up the raw data and looked at it again. She had a way of looking at data that was different from how most analysts looked at data. Most analysts looked for what was there. Mirren looked for what the data was doing, the shape of it, the structure. The Ceres reading had structure. Very faint structure, but structure. Random data had a specific texture to it when you looked at enough of it. A kind of statistical noise that felt like static. This reading had something underneath the noise. Something ordered. Something that repeated at intervals too regular to be natural. She sat very still for a long time. Then she opened a formal request for a deep-range scout mission to the asteroid belt. Admiral Dirac rejected the request in 40 minutes. He did not write a long rejection. He wrote 4 words: "The war is over." His communications officer forwarded the rejection to Mirren's terminal, and that was the end of it, officially. Mirren stared at the 4 words for a while. Then she did something that was, technically, a minor violation of Conclave intelligence protocols. She accessed the long-range scanner archive, going back 14 months, and pulled every reading from the asteroid belt region. She ran her own analysis on the full dataset. It took her 3 days, working during off hours, when the division was quiet. What she found made her sit back in her chair and not move for a very long time. The signal was not new. It had been building for months. Not loudly, nothing the standard automated scanners would catch, because the standard automated scanners were calibrated to look for known signal types. This signal was not a known type. It was not communication, it was not navigation. It was not any category in the Conclave signal library, which was extensive enough that something being absent from it was itself a significant fact. The closest thing she could find in the library was something called a distribution packet, a specific type of signal used to transmit large amounts of compressed data to multiple receivers simultaneously. But distribution packets were a known technology. They had a specific signature. Older in some ways, newer in others, like something designed by someone who knew what a distribution packet was, and had deliberately built something that would do the same job, but look completely different. Humans, she thought. Of course. She wrote a second report. This one was longer and more detailed than the first. She included the full data analysis, the signal comparison tables, 3 separate models of what the signal might be doing, and a conclusion that she had thought carefully about before writing, because she knew how it would sound. The conclusion was this: the signal appeared to be a targeting system, not a weapon, not a navigation beacon in the conventional sense. Something designed to find specific receivers at a specific time and deliver a specific package of information to them. The signal was still building. Based on the rate of construction she had observed in the data, she estimated it would be complete in approximately 55 days. She submitted the report to her senior officer. She copied it to 3 other departments. She marked it Priority 1, which was technically above her authority to do, because she was junior. Her senior officer called her into his office the next morning and told her, in careful and not unkind language, that she was experiencing what was sometimes called post-conflict analytical anxiety, a tendency in intelligence analysts to find threats in clean data after a period of sustained high-stress work. He suggested she take her allocated rest period. He told her the war was over. He told her the humans were gone. She thanked him for his time. She did not take her rest period. She sat at her terminal and watched the signal build, day by day, the way you might watch a storm forming on the horizon when everyone around you kept insisting the sky was clear. On Ceres, Junho received the notification of Mirren's scout request rejection through a relay he had no business being able to access, which he had accessed anyway, because that was the kind of engineer he was. He read the 4-word rejection. He read the timestamp. He checked the progress of the beacon signal on his own panel. He allowed himself the small, tired smile. They had found the signal. One of them had found it, anyway. And they had buried it under 4 words and sent it back. That was fine. That was expected. He had built the timing around exactly that kind of response. Day was standing behind him. She had read the notification over his shoulder. They know something is there, she said. One of them does, Junho said. Is that a problem? He thought about it. He looked at the timer. 42 days remaining. No, he said. She's too junior and she's too right. Nobody will listen to her until it's too late to matter. Day was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to count on. It's not counting on it, Junho said. It's knowing how institutions work. They didn't build a galaxy-spanning military coalition by being good at listening to junior analysts who say uncomfortable things. He paused. We did, though. Day looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. We did, she agreed. The beacon kept building in the dark, quiet and patient, like everything the humans had done for the last 9 years. Quiet, patient, completely invisible to everyone who had already decided there was nothing left to see. The aliens celebrated humanity's eradication. Then, the beacon activated. Part 4. What the beacon said. On the morning of Day 0, Admiral Dirac was eating breakfast. It was a quiet morning on the command ship. The main fleet had mostly dispersed back to their home systems after the formal victory ceremonies ended. A skeleton crew remained near Earth's orbit, mostly out of routine. Someone had to file the final survey reports, catalog the debris fields, confirm the official extinction numbers for Conclave records. Dirac had stayed because he was thorough, and because going home felt strange after 6 years of war. He was not sure what he would do with himself when he got there. He was thinking about this, eating a bowl of something warm and grain-based, when every screen on his ship lit up at the same time. Not just his ship. Every Conclave ship in range, every orbital station, every deep space relay, every long-range array pointed in the general direction of this solar system. All of them, simultaneously, received the same transmission. The transmission was not long. It was not encrypted. It did not need to be either of those things, because it had already been delivered before anyone could think to block it. Slipped through every communication system in range at a frequency that the Conclave's filters did not cover, because it was not a frequency the Conclave had ever thought to filter for. It contained 2 things. The first was a coordinates packet. 17 sets of coordinates, each one pointing to a different location in deep space, all of them well outside the charted galaxy, in the dark between star systems where nothing was supposed to be. The kind of precise that meant they had been calculated very carefully, very far in advance. The second was a single line of text, translated cleanly and correctly into all 17 languages of the Conclave member species. Translated so well, in fact, that the grammar was perfect in every language, with no errors and no awkward phrasing, the kind of translation that took years to prepare. We taught the beacon to find you first. Dirac read it twice. He put down his breakfast. He looked at his communications officer, who looked back at him with an expression that was trying very hard to remain professional and not quite succeeding. Source? Dirac asked. Asteroid belt, sir. A pause. The Ceres region. He was very still for a moment. Then he thought about a 4-word rejection he had sent 42 days ago to a junior analyst in the intelligence division. He thought about it in the specific way a person thinks about something when they have just understood, too late, that they made a mistake. He did not say anything about that. He straightened in his chair and started giving orders. Within 2 hours, the coordinates had been verified by every deep space array the Conclave had access to. What those arrays found at each set of coordinates was not debris. It was not natural objects. It was not anything that should have been there, according to every record in the Conclave's database of explored space. 17 ships, large ones, moving toward the inner galaxy, toward Conclave space, toward home. The analysis reports came in fast, each one landing on Dirac's screen with a quiet chime that was starting to feel very loud. The ships matched no known Conclave design. They matched no known alien design. What they did match, in structural silhouette and energy signature and drive plume characteristics, was human engineering, but human engineering that had evolved significantly from anything the Conclave had encountered during the war. 11 years of development, minimum, probably more. Building in the dark, outside the galaxy, with no interference, no resource constraints from fighting a war, no pressure except the one goal they had been sent out there to accomplish. The ships were not warships, they were arcs. The long-range bioscanners, once they got close enough to be useful, confirmed life signs. Human life signs, thousands of them per vessel. People who had been born out there in the deep dark, or had been children when the ships launched, and were adults now. A generation that had grown up knowing exactly what they were going back for. Someone had put them out there. Someone had launched 17 ships, one at a time, over 9 years. Each launch covered so carefully that the Conclave had never detected a single one. Someone had planned this when the war was only 2 years old. Someone had looked at the math of the war and understood, probably earlier than anyone else, that Earth would not survive. And instead of spending those remaining years fighting a losing battle purely on principle, they had spent them doing the one thing that actually mattered: making sure humanity survived it. On Ceres, Junho was standing at the panel when the signal completed. The green light had been on for 97 days. Now a second light came on beside it, white, steady, clean. Confirmation that the packet had been received, that the coordinates had been delivered, that every Conclave system in range had gotten the message before anyone could stop it. He stood there and looked at the two lights for a while. Day came and stood beside him. She had known it was time, because the quality of his silence had changed. There was something different in the stillness of him when things were working as planned, versus when they were waiting to see if things would work. "It went out?" she asked. "All 17 delivery confirmations received," he said. "The ships got it. They know where to come." She was quiet. He was quiet. The air recyclers hummed. "How long until they're in range?" she said. 14 days at current speed." He paused. "Probably less. They'll push the drives when they get the confirmation." Then she asked the question he had known she would ask eventually. The one neither of them had said out loud in 97 days of sitting in this rock together. "Do you think they're okay? The people on those ships?" He thought about it for a long time, in his careful way. He thought about the engineers he had worked with who had designed the life support systems. He thought about the nutritionists who had calculated food production for a 30-year voyage. He thought about the educators, the doctors, the people who had quietly boarded those ships, carrying every piece of human knowledge they could compress onto storage systems that would last for decades. "They were built to last," he said. "We'd built them to last." It was not a perfect answer. He knew that, and she knew that. 14 years in the deep dark, cut off from everything, knowing that the world they came from was probably gone. That was not something any engineering spec could fully account for. But it was the honest answer, and honest was what they had. She reached out and put her hand on the panel, beside the two lights for a moment. A small gesture, barely visible, the kind of thing a person did when they needed contact with something real. Then she pulled her hand back and stood straight again, and they both turned to look at the screen, where the first feed from the long-range scanner was beginning to come in, grainy, distant, but unmistakable. 17 ships, moving through the dark, coming home. Darrett's fleet was already moving to intercept. Rail was already being pulled from whatever diplomatic meeting he had been in. Somewhere in the intelligence division, Miran had opened her screen to find 3 separate urgent messages from senior officers who wanted to talk to her immediately about a report she had filed 40 days ago that they had told her was not worth reading. She had not yet responded to any of those messages. She was sitting at her desk, reading the single translated line of text that the beacon had sent out, reading it again and again, and she was thinking about the 9 years of faint structured signals she had never been able to fully explain. And she was thinking about the humans, and the way they had stopped fighting 3 months before the end. And she was arriving, slowly, and with the particular feeling of someone watching a thing become clear, that they had seen blurry for a very long time, at an understanding of what had actually happened. They had not surrendered. They had redirected. Every resource, every bit of fight that could be spared, every engineer, every scientist, every person who could be trusted to disappear quietly and not be found, redirected away from a war they could not win, and into something that could not be bombed, could not be besieged, could not be starved out, or worn down, or destroyed from orbit. The future. Mirren put her head down on her desk, and stayed that way for a little while. Not out of grief, out of something more complicated than that. A recognition that she had been right, and that being right about this particular thing meant the last thing the Conclave wanted to hear was waiting at the edge of the galaxy, 14 days away, and coming in fast. The aliens celebrated humanity's eradication. Then the beacon activated. Part 5. Humanity doesn't negotiate. The 17 ships dropped out of deep travel on the 14th day, exactly when Junho had said they would. They came in slow, not cautiously. The distinction mattered. Cautious was what something did when it was afraid of what it was approaching. These ships came in slow deliberately, with the measured, unhurried pace of something that had all the time in the world, and knew it. Each vessel held formation with the others, in a widespread pattern that the Conclave's tactical analysts immediately recognized was not a battle formation. It was a display. It was meant to be seen clearly. They were seen clearly. Derek had assembled every ship he could recall in 14 days. The Conclave's military infrastructure was large, and it had not been demobilized yet. Victories took time to wind down. Paperwork and ceremonies and the logistics of moving fleets back to home ports. What he had managed to gather was an imposing force. He was aware, looking at the spread of his ships on the tactical display, that he should feel confident. He did not especially feel confident. The lead ship of the 17 was called the Minjay. It was larger than the others, not by design. It had simply accumulated modifications over the years, additions and improvements bolted onto the original frame, until the original was more of a skeleton inside something that had grown around it. It looked like what it was, a ship that had been built, then lived in, then built upon again, by people who were very serious about what they were doing. On its bridge, a woman named Day stood at the helm console and looked at the tactical display, showing the Conclave fleet spread out ahead. She had seen Conclave fleet formations before. She had flown against them once, in a different life, when she had been a pilot in a defense corps that no longer existed. The formation ahead of her was larger than anything she had faced then. Better equipped, freshly supplied, and angry in the specific way that powerful things got angry when they were surprised. She did not find it especially intimidating. That was not bravado. It was 14 years of living in the deep dark, with two options: get stronger or fall apart. She had chosen the first option every single morning for 14 years, and the choosing had become as automatic as breathing. "They're hailing us," said the communications officer beside her. "I know," Day said. "Don't answer yet." She turned and looked at the man sitting at the secondary console behind her. He had come aboard at Ceres 3 days ago, transferred up from the asteroid with Day and the bare bones of what had been kept running in that rock chamber for the last 11 years. He looked exactly like she remembered him, slightly rumpled, very still, the quiet that surrounded him so complete it was almost physical. Junho looked up from his screen. He met her eyes. He gave her a small nod. She turned back to the display. "Answer them," she said. Darek's face appeared on the main screen. He looked like a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation, and was not sure which one applied. "This is Admiral Darak of the Conclave Combined Fleet," he said. "You are entering restricted space. Identify yourselves and state your intentions." Day looked at him for a moment without speaking. She was thinking about the right first word. The first word mattered. "Humans," she said. 17 vessels, roughly 170,000 people. As for intentions, she paused, not for effect, because she was choosing the honest answer over the dramatic one, which was sometimes hard when the dramatic one was right there. "We're here to rebuild." There was a silence on Darak's end. She watched him process the number. 170,000. She could see him running the same calculation every conclave tactician had been running for 3 days, ever since the ships were confirmed. These were not warships. They carried families and children, and the compressed knowledge of a civilization. They also carried, in their lower holds and modified cargo bays and retrofitted weapons platforms, 14 years of uninterrupted engineering development by people with nothing to lose and one very specific goal. The Conclave did not know the full scope of what was in those holds. She was content to let them figure it out gradually. "Rebuild what?" Derek said. "Humanity," she said. "And eventually, the relationship between humanity and the rest of this galaxy. That second part is going to take longer and be considerably more complicated. But we have time." Rael was patched in 12 minutes later. He had clearly been pulled out of something in a hurry. His diplomatic robes were not quite straight, and there was an energy about him that was trying very hard to look composed. He was a skilled diplomat. She respected skilled people, even the ones she was negotiating against. "There are protocols," Rael said, "for the resumption of diplomatic contact following a state of war. The Conclave would be willing to open formal negotiations on the question of human resettlement, under the condition that—" "We're not asking for resettlement," Junho said from his console. He had not announced himself. Rael blinked at the new voice. "Then what?" "We're informing you that we're here," Junho said. "We're informing you of our numbers and our approximate capabilities and our general intentions. That's not negotiation. That's courtesy." Another silence. Rael's 4 arms moved in the small, controlled way they did when he was recalculating. "The Conclave has concerns." "The Conclave has many concerns," Junho said. "We understand that. We're one of them." He looked at his screen, not at the display. "Running something. We are not going to request permission to exist. We are not going to accept a supervised resettlement under Conclave oversight. We are not going to submit our technological development to Conclave review." He paused. "What we are going to do is find a location to establish a settlement, begin reconstruction, and be available for diplomatic contact on terms that treat us as a sovereign people. That's the offer. It's the only offer." Rael stared at him. Then he stared at Day, who stared back with the expression of a person who had said everything she needed to say, and was content to wait. "That is not how negotiations work," Rael said finally. "Humanity doesn't negotiate," Junho said. "We rebuild." The standoff lasted 4 days. The Conclave fleet held position. The 17 ships held position. No shots were fired. No ultimatums were formally issued. Mirren, who had been elevated in a remarkable 48 hours from junior analyst to primary human affairs consultant, spent those 4 days writing briefings that were increasingly frank about what the Conclave was actually dealing with. She wrote them clearly and without comfort, because comfort was not what the situation called for. What the situation called for was honesty. The honesty was this: the humans had 170,000 people and 14 years of uninterrupted weapons development in arcs that had been built by engineers who had nothing else to do. The Conclave did not know exactly what those weapons could do. The humans were not telling them. The Conclave could attempt to destroy the 17 ships, and might succeed, though Mirren's analysis suggested the cost would be severe. But the result would be the same as bombing Earth had been. They would kill the people, because the humans had already proven, with 14 years of evidence, that the idea was the thing you could not touch. She wrote at the bottom of her final briefing, "This species does not surrender. They redirect. If we engage them, they will simply send more ships further out, and we will have this conversation again in 20 years with a larger fleet and a harder problem. The only option that ends with a stable galaxy is one where humans are in it." Derek read the briefing. He sat with it for a long time. Then he called a senior staff meeting and said, with the voice of a man closing a very long chapter of his life, "Someone get Rael back on the line." On the bridge of the Minje, Day was looking out at the stars when the hail came in. Not Earth's stars. Earth was gone. These were different stars, unknown to her in childhood, learned during 14 years of the longest journey any human had ever made. She had names for some of them now. Not official names, just the names the ship's crew had given them during the long, dark years. Names that would probably never appear on any official chart. She answered the hail. She listened to what Derek said. She kept her face calm and professional, because this was not the moment for anything else. When the channel closed, she turned around. Junho was already looking at her. He had heard. First formal contact meeting in 8 days, she said. Neutral location. Derek's attending in person. Rael will be the lead negotiator. It's not negotiation, Junho said. We said that. I know what we said. She looked at him. But we'll have the conversation anyway. That's how this starts. He nodded. He looked at his screen for a moment. Then he looked back up at her. Do you think it'll work? He asked. The long version. Not the next 8 days. The actual long version. She thought about 170,000 people in 17 ships. She thought about the children who had been born on those ships, who had never seen Earth, who only knew it as something their parents talked about, with a specific quality of quiet in their voices. She thought about what those children were going to build in the years ahead, what they were going to grow into, what they were going to demand of a galaxy that had decided, once, that they had no right to exist. We're still here, she said. That was supposed to be impossible. Everything after this is just work. She turned back to the viewport and looked at the stars. Around them, the ship hummed, full of people who had come a very long way and were not finished yet. Outside, the Conclave fleet held its position and waited, and the galaxy, slowly and with some difficulty, began to understand that the war it had thought it won was not the war that actually mattered. The war that mattered had been quiet, patient, completely invisible, and humanity had won it a long time ago.